So, John, what have you got for us today to talk about?
Okay, well, a quite recently published book is by Patrick Graupp, Steward and Brad Parsons, called Creating an Effective Management System, subtitle of which, Integrating Policy Deployment, TWI and Kata. So I think this is an interesting book in as far as there have been in the past quite a number of books in each one of these separate
Those
areas. So
areas,
there's
yeah.
been books on policy deployment, quite a lot on Kata with Mike Rother's
Yep.
Toyota Kata, and quite a lot on TWI, many of which by Patrick Graupp himself. But this one brings these three areas together quite nicely, I think. And also, over the last couple of years, there have been quite a proliferation of conferences actually on TWI Kata particularly, and the fact that these two areas mesh quite nicely with one another. But this is the first book that I'm aware of that actually uh, integrates these areas nicely together.
Okay. They've come up with quite an interesting model that has some sort of synergy with the House of Lean. So could you just talk about how that model sort of fits that together? Because I think they're looking at some systems thinking and sort of the thinking behind the sort of models and the tools and everything that probably everybody's fallen foul of at some point. So could you just elaborate on what that model looks like, bringing those three elements together?
Yes, okay. But just before we do that, I'd like to just give a quote from George Box, who actually was an old professor of mine once upon a time. George Box had a famous quote, which was, "All models are wrong, some models are useful." And so I think that's a good thing to bear in mind. So
So
all
can
models
you
are wrong.
walk us through what's good or useful about these?
Yeah, well, now you mentioned the Toyota House of Lean, and
Yeah.
which of course is a model that is widely used, and in fact these days just about every company's got its own version of the
Yeah.
House of Lean, including of course Toyota itself, uh, and often starts with, for example, standard work as the foundation, and then two of the pillars being just in time and Judoka. And it's quite a useful model in as far as it puts together quite a lot of these ideas. But what I'm not quite sure of is it doesn't show how these various factors integrate very well. Uh, Also, I think there are a lot of words in these House of Lean that not everybody understands all that well.
Yeah.
So the model that these people have used in this one is called the gear train model, which actually integrates these three areas. So at the top of the high level gear is about policy deployment, and that's a less frequently rotating gear, if you like. So you'd be thinking about that policy deployment once a year, perhaps. That in fact brings out various aspects that you need a little bit more exploration on via, for example, TW by Kata, and you could get after the experimental approach and do Kata step-by-step improvement to move you towards the policy deployment end. And then, and in so doing, you actually might expose various problems. So the problems that you might expose or barriers that you might be confronted with would be, first of all, let's say a people barrier, in which case you could get after it with a TWI training with industry, job relations
Yep.
methodology, or you might have a process problem, in which case the TWI job methods might be applicable, or you might have a problem with the nature of work. So maybe JI, job instruction, is more applicable. So in that respect, the what flows down from the high level on policy deployment goes down to the Kata level, and then what comes out of Kata is various problems which you could address via these established TWI sort of concepts.
So TWI has had a little bit of a resurgence,
Yeah.
and is sort of coming back. And I don't know how new that is because this is based around healthcare. So could you just talk a little bit about that and how that's sort of come back into vogue?
Yeah, well, of course, TWI is something that started in the United States during the Second World War as a result of the sort of productivity crisis, and then during the Second World War moved to Europe, and after the Second World War moved to Japan, including Toyota. But actually, it was something that was pretty well forgotten in the West for several decades, but not with Toyota actually. And I do think that TWI, at least I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that TWI is the foundation of the Toyota production system. So they talk about the three-legged stool in TWI. So the three-legged stool being job instruction, how to teach a job, job methods, how to improve a job, and job relations, how to work with your people. So those three are the system that fit together. And today at Toyota, JI is still used for the way to train people. JM has morphed into Kaizen, and job relations is still the foundation of say team leaders working with their people on the basis of respect for people. So it's interesting that it was forgotten about for several decades, but now has been resurfaced. I'm glad to say in the last perhaps 15 years or so in the West.
Do you think that's sort of the sort of use of language, and maybe we sort of piled things on? You talked about earlier about using terminology that people aren't familiar with. Do you think we kind of overcomplicated that language, and then HR came in, and then the sort of task has been separated, and then we've got engagement in there, but nobody can really define what that means? So do you think that's kind of taking that back to a more basic understanding of what we're trying to do?
I think so, yes. So this, remember, this goes back to the Second World War period of time, and where people, they were training a whole new workforce, and so actually they couldn't be involved with what we'll talk about in a later session, bullshit, actually. So the TWI is really no bullshit. So, like for example, in job relations, the foundations are just foundations for job relations, which I'll just read out here. Let each worker now know how he or she is doing. Give credit where due. Tell people in advance about changes that will affect them, and make best use of each person's ability. So there's no bull in that. That's just
really concise
basic
and simple.
And you know, I do think that in many respects, some of those ideas are sometimes forgotten by managers, and even worse, possibly by human resource people that have gone off on all sorts of fancy programs, but maybe forgotten some of the essentials, if you like. So. So I think this is good stuff to be reminded of, and on these sort of essential basics. Yeah.
And this book's largely for healthcare, and I think what's really interested in is using this sort of systems thinking, and then that within the systems thinking. But is this relevant still for sort of lean practitioners now in other areas, and worth looking at and considering?
Yes, so yes, you're right. So that in fact, two of the authors here, Skip Steward and Brad Parsons, work for a medical for a hospital group in the US. So a lot of the examples in this book are really hospital related, and in that respect, I think this is a superb book for anybody involved in hospital type lean. On the other hand, I think that Patrick Graupp, that the TWI master trainer, has got wide experience in all sorts of areas. So it's not only a book for healthcare professionals, it's also I think very useful for people in manufacturing as well, especially as we say, how to bring these three concepts, policy,
together.
deployment, TWI, together.
Yeah.
Now you mentioned about the idea of systems, and I think that's integrated in the idea of the gear train model. So they talk quite a lot about Russell Ackoff, who's one of the grand old men of systems thinking. So Ackoff had this famous analogy he used to talk about was the car. So if you take the best engine, the best brakes, the best body, the best this and that, and you join them together, do you get the best car? No, you don't.
No.
So in fact, you might not even get a car that works. So the point is the systems thing is to think about as a totality, and how these various parts work together. Not that you after the best individual part. It's how
But
more important
bringing it all
how to integrate these parts together. And so that fits in very nicely with this idea of that the book is really all about.
And maybe, taking some of the learnings from some of the mistakes that have been made with sort of deploying lean philosophies and methodologies in the past, and sort of doing something different with those.
Yeah,
so
so
that sounds interesting.
There's many practical examples here that, as you say, I think we'd find quite useful in both manufacturing and service. But I think for me, one of the interesting things about the book was these two appendices. The one, Appendix 1, overall management system review questions, and Appendix 2, which was about TWI implementation review questions. And well, there are a heck of a lot of these questions in these two appendices. But I think these appendices are in fact an incredibly useful part of the book, and so I think that many managers would do very well by looking through these questions and looking at themselves in relation to these the questions that are being asked. So I think that's something that's particularly valuable in this with this little book.
Thank you.
So happy reading. I think
Yes.
I think.
Yeah, can I
it's
have
really
your
great.
signed copy?
No.